Joining me for more on this and a bit of a look around the world, James Brown from the US Studies Centre. James Brown, I don't think anything quite tells a story better than bow and arrows in the city of Hong Kong being used by students, to protect their particular area. What's your take on where we're at with Hong Kong?
It's quite amazing. I mean, these are scenes you normally see in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in war-torn cities, but we're seeing them in Hong Kong, one of the most important financial centres in the world, and a place where up to 100,000 Australians live, work and travel. So this week has been a very violent week in Hong Kong. We saw police shoot a number of protesters. We saw protesters set a man believed to be supporting police on fire, and there's been rolling protests, a lot of damage of infrastructure. It's really escalated this week. It's quite an extraordinary thing to see happening.
So you mentioned the person being set alight, which was on Twitter, and you could actually watch the whole thing, disturbingly enough. This has got to be the worry for the protest movement, that police up the ante on violence. You've got thousands and thousands of protesters, and they don't work for anyone, so it's always going to be a case where you'll have the occasional violent incident, albeit the setting someone alight's probably a real extreme, but this isn't going to help them. And the more things ratchet up in a violent sense, the more it suits the authorities, the police in Beijing. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the protesters, they are desperate. They don't see how this is going to get better for them, so that does mean they're willing to take more extreme measures. And because this is largely a leaderless movement, if you get extreme aspects of the protest groups who want to escalate, who want to be more violent, it's very hard to keep them under control. In situations like this, you do also see people working to provoke some of those groups as well, trying to spur them into violence precisely because it will help them lose support in Hong Kong. It just continues to up the stakes and move this closer to the point where you might see the People's Armed Police come from Shenzhen and re-establish control in Hong Kong.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the tipping point people are waiting for. Anyway, we'll keep a close eye on it. Impeachment proceedings are in the headlines, of course. It's going public now, effectively. What did you make of the beginning of this? Some were saying it was a bit lacking in theatre, which is what it's all about, I guess.
Well, to define it by the standards that President Trump and a lot of Americans would define it by, the ratings for this television show were quite low. Only 13 million Americans tuned in, as compared to what's been as high as 20 million Americans for things like the James Comey testimony. This was, I guess, a draw. You saw some seasoned State Department officials testify, giving voice and giving weight to some of the facts that have only been reported from transcripts so far. I don't think either of them landed a killer blow. There was some discussion about the role of Rudy Giuliani and the president's sort of private foreign policy agenda, but not a lot of new facts were put on the table, and there were a couple that were, but they were mostly based on hearsay. And the Republicans were able to muddy the waters on this one and point to a lot of conspiracy theories and questions, so I think it's a draw for this week.
Right, because the thing here about the impeachment, if we're going to be realistic about it right now, it's not about impeachment. Obviously, it's about the 2020 election, and that, I guess, is why the theatre matters. The viewers, what is seen as, something dramatic that can change someone's mind, get them off the fence or get them even to switch sides.
That's right. I mean, there are two juries here. The Senate, they're not going to change their minds. They're not going to vote for impeachment, but the real jury is the American voters. And at this stage, you would say there was nothing we saw this week that would shift a large chunk of voters. They are waiting, I think two things will shift voters to the Democratic side in this election. One is a candidate they can unify behind on the Democrat side, and they don't have that at the moment, although we've seen a couple of new entrants in the last couple of weeks, Deval Patrick and Michael Bloomberg. But the other is some sort of sense that Trump has failed them in some way. That may come from these impeachment hearings, or it may come from his handling of other issues like the economy or his foreign policy difficulties.
Speaking of, Donald Trump over meeting with President Erdogan from Turkey. Now, he's praised him. He's adamant that there's a good relationship with the Kurds. Let's have a listen to Donald Trump, first of all.
I think the president, he may have some factions within the Kurds, but I think the president has a great relationship with the Kurds. Many Kurds live currently in Turkey, and they're happy and they're taken care of, including health care. We were talking about it before, including health care and education and other things. So that's really a misnomer. But our relationship with the Kurds has been a very good one.
Quick fact check, I guess, on that, James Brown. Many Turks living happily in Turkey, everything's fine?
I think we'd probably call that one fake news. It's the president likes to be optimistic, particularly when he's praising strong leaders that he admires, and he said that he was a big fan of Erdogan this week in their joint press conference. I don't think he'd say that anyone else is buying the fact that there's bliss and harmony between the Kurds and Turkey, certainly not the 5 Republican senators who were invited to a meeting with the Turkish leader and who really gave him a very hard time on his human rights treatment of the Kurds, and also his increasing coziness with Russia, particularly through the purchase of a Russian air defence missile system.
Well, what's the plight right now of Kurdish people? Because we heard a lot straight after the decision by Donald Trump, but a little bit less since. Has anything changed in terms of likelihood of, well, their situation, and to what extent they're going to be able to forge a life beyond this little zone they're trying to be pushed into?
Well, they've taken an enormous blow. There's been a lot of deaths, not only from Turkish forces, but from the Turkish militias, who were quite wanton in their killing of Kurdish political leaders and civilians. The Turks didn't quite push as far as they intended to in their operation. They've only really pushed about 2/3 of the way that they intended to, so they have squeezed the territory that the Kurds control. The Kurds are just in a very difficult position now because they can't rely on the US for military support, for weapons, for funds. They're having to ally themselves with others in the region, and that includes looking to other players in Syria to give them some sort of support or to make some sort of accommodation with them. So it's a very precarious position for the Kurdish nations and peoples in that part of the world.
Just wanted to ask you finally about Ben Roberts-Smith. He's come out and said if anyone asked him now for advice, he'd say don't join the ADF, and has pointed the finger at a lack of support for veterans and also at the top brass saying they should be replaced. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, I wouldn't support his comments that the top brass of the Defence Force should be replaced. I don't think we've ever had such impressive leadership in the Defence Force at the moment. But I think he is right when he points to the lack of leadership on this issue. And the problem here is this is an all-of-government issue. The veterans are falling into the cracks when they move from Defence to Department of Veterans Affairs. So for the Minister for Veterans Affairs to say, hey, DVA's got it, it's under control, that's not enough. We've got to look at defence as well, and that's why Ben Roberts-Smith and others have been calling for national leadership on this, either from an intervention by the Prime Minister or through a Royal Commission into this whole veteran system which is failing veterans and their families.
James Brown from the US Studies Centre, thanks for your time.